Hi, welcome to our quick video here on polling and public opinion. Alright, so we're going to talk about public opinion and measuring how we measure attitudes about politics around the country. Alright, how do we get that information? And again, this is information that the public generally is very interested in, politicians are very interested in, and it's a way to kind of gauge the public sentiment towards the possibility of a policy being put into effect, the results of a particular policy, and basically it's to take the temperature of the nation. It could be broken down into a region, it could be broken down to a state, it could be even at the local level, it could be a school poll, you know, how everyone feels here at Herndon High School. So we're going to take a look at how public opinion is measured. And public opinion is measured in the United States by using polls. All right, and we're going to talk a little bit about polls and how they're conducted. So let's just start there. Polls are basically going to be questionnaires. We're going to go out and we're going to ask citizens how they feel about a particular issue. Or let's say, for example, here at Herndon High School, it could be even students. The first thing that's going to be crucial to a valid opinion poll is going to be the concept of random sampling. And again, this is really the key to get a good result out of your poll. And again, basically it operates on the idea that every single person that is targeted for a particular poll should have an equal opportunity and probability of being selected for that sample. All right, and then again, we're trying to get a sampling error of plus or minus 3%. That gives us an accurate representation. Again, we're not going to be able to poll everyone. All right, it's not realistic to say, hey, we're going to go out and we're going to poll out of the 300 million people in the United States, we're going to poll 50 million people. That's not reality. Generally, these polls rely on sample sizes somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people. And as long as this sample is random, these polls have and can be very accurate. All right, there's a couple different ways of selecting your sample. One way is the quota sample. And again, this is going to be proportionate to population. So whatever your sample is going to be, is you're going to go out and you're going to make sure that your sample is equal to the overall makeup of your population. So if you're going to go out and do a poll for a national poll and use a quota sample, you're going to have to represent all of those ethnicities accurately, and they're going to have to be randomly picked out of those subgroups. You're going to have to, if you're going to quote a sample, it has to be random, and you're going to use basically the same percentages that those individual groups make up that whole group. All right. You also can use stratified sampling, and again, that's using our census to divide the country into regions, and then selecting counties and other statistical areas in relation to the total population. So there's two ways to do that. You can do by quota, or you can do a stratified sample. Okay, there's a couple different methods of how we actually poll and how we ask these questions. The telephone is the most common. I'm sure all of you probably have experienced pollsters calling your home phone. I know that I've, during the political season, my home phone is inundated with calls on poll calls from various different campaigns. Could be local level. I've had multiple calls for the gubernatorial race. Last year during the presidential race, I had multiple calls for both sides, for the Republicans and Democrats, trying to gauge, you know, what direction or who I was going to vote for. You also can have door-to-door. Some of you have actually are working currently in political campaigns, and a lot of you have done some door knocking, and you've actually been going to door to door and doing basically a poll, you know, on foot, a grassroots level poll, knocking on doors. We also have some use of text. Again, technology has made its way into the poll process, and we also have the internet, which is probably the future of polling, since a lot of people aren't or don't even have home phones anymore. The future of polling really is probably in using the internet, smartphones. You know, that's the direction that it's going. Okay, so we know what polls are. We got the basics. Some of the things that really matter in polls are the way that the questions are worded. Again, those words can be very powerful. And again, the companies that have been doing these polls, these well-respected companies like Gallup, is a great example, been around for a very long time. They really know, after a long period of trial and error, how questions can be worded to give a neutral response. And here's one of the questions, and this goes back a little bit. Back in 1985, a question was asked if the public agreed that the country wasn't spending enough on welfare. So this is the midst of the Reagan era with great cuts to social programs. So they went out and they asked everyone, you know, is the couple, or how many of you agree that the country is not spending enough on welfare? And 19% of Americans responded favorably, yes, we are not spending enough on welfare. Well, when they reworded the question and they did the poll again, and they changed the word welfare, which has a negative connotation, to assistance to the poor, the response went from a 19% saying, yes, we're not doing enough, to 67% saying, yes, we are not doing enough. So you can see there the power of words, the negative connotation that goes along with welfare, and the positive connotation or the positive vision that people have when they hear assistance to the poor. So words do matter. Here's a quote from Winston Churchill, and it kind of highlights the issue with public opinion polling in terms of the danger of always being kind of in tune with the poll, and how politicians, if they get too wrapped up in the public opinion, it's going to take away their ability or their courage to do what they actually believe. All right, and you can go ahead and read that quote. Pretty good stuff from Winston Churchill. All right, so how do we measure it? Okay, now when we're measuring public opinion in the United States, what we find out is that Americans don't really know much about politics. Less than half of the public actually knows who their congressman is, all right, who their House of Representatives member and the senators for their state. That's pretty sad. Americans generally have some idea of basic beliefs, but they really don't know how those beliefs affect a government policy, how policy is made, the lawmaking process. Again, we talked about this on day one. You know, you ask somebody, hey, tell me about government, you know, tell me about democracy. The first thing that they're probably going to bring up is, you know, those fundamental freedoms. I have the right to say whatever I want. But beyond that, you know, Americans aren't going to have a ton of knowledge. The other thing that we find is the decline in trust in government. You guys are going to see this on the assignments page here on Blackboard. There's a couple articles linked in there that basically since the 1960s, American trust in government has been on the decline. And we can point to a lot of factors there. You know, the Vietnam War, anti-war protests, the counterculture movements, the civil rights movement, you know, the Watergate scandal. All of those events in sequence was really going to start to get people to pay more attention to government in terms of the negative aspects. Up to that point, the relationship between government leadership, the press, and the public was pretty favorable. But since the 1960s, there's been a growing sense of distrust. And I think you guys can see that recently with all of the talk of the NSA and all of the different levels of information gathering that the government participates in with really not a great deal of public knowledge. There was an uptick right around September 11th after that tragic event. Again, you can kind of see how world events and history can affect people's attitudes, but again, those bumps and positive or negative declines generally are associated with events in history. All right, the role of polls. All right, what is their role in American democracy, American politics? Well, polls really do help politicians figure out the public preference and what they want. And again, we just mentioned in the Winston Churchill quote, kind of highlights the issue or how that can maybe it can have both positive and negative impact. And question you can kind of ask, does it really make politicians think more about following the polls? All right, you know, how much influence does the poll have? One example of a poll is an exit poll, and exit polls, a lot of the information that you guys looked at in your demography activity or the demographics activity is focused on exit polls. And an exit poll really is where the media is going to ask people as they leave polling stations, as they are finished voting, they'll take some statistical information about their ethnicity, maybe their age, their sex, and they'll ask them some basic questions on how they voted. And generally this information has been pretty accurate, all right, and been a great way for us to forecast winners and losers in election races. All right, so the last thing here, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about how Americans participate in government. And participation, we talk about political participation, we're talking about any and all activities that citizens can use to influence the selection of candidates, the selection of political leaders, and also how they influence policy decisions. There's two basic types of participation in the United States. We have conventional and unconventional. And again, the line between these two sometimes gets a little blurry. Conventional, you'll see, includes voting, campaign work, and running for political office. Pretty obvious. And of course, voting is the most common. And we also have unconventional methods of participation. And these have been used in the United States for a very long time. We have protest. And if you think about your U.S. history course from last year, you can remember some of the protests that took place around the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement of the 1960s, all very influential in American history, and they revolve around a lot of public protest. We also had civil disobedience, and Martin Luther King is a great example of breaking the law with the idea that it's going to gain exposure, it's going to shed light on a particular topic. You know, if I break the law and I'm arrested, I'm going to get some publicity. It's going to bring public's attention to the plight. Let's say, for example, you know, the counter sit-ins during the civil rights movement. And then finally, violence. Violence is something that is a part or has been a part of political participation since the very beginning of the United States. We're a country that was born from revolution. And if you go through history, you can see violence taking place. Probably the most contemporary example is going to be during the 1960s, again, around the civil rights, the anti-war movement. All right, thanks for spending a couple minutes here talking about public opinion polls and American participation in politics. Make sure that you finish up your assignment on Blackboard for this topic.